One of the unsung privileges of life is the fact that you can think. I mean, think about it. You can think, and your life is really the product of millions of thoughts that you've had. It's a real gift that we have, and our thoughts come in all different shapes and sizes, a bit like the books in my book cupboard. Some of them are hard to locate and random, like the books in my book cupboard. Some are light and hopeful, but some of our thoughts are also dark and maybe even embarrassing. Some of our thoughts are small and trivial and maybe unremarkable, but some thoughts that we have are huge. They're radical. They're life-changing. In fact, some thoughts have changed the world. And today, let's talk about a thought that has absolutely changed the world. Most of our thoughts are not original, at least mine aren't, but somehow we collect them along the way, like books in a bookcase. And over time we make them our own, we adopt them, and they become our thoughts, they become our tastes, our preferences, our biases, be that our brand of politics, or our football team, or our opinions on God, or anything else for that matter, till eventually, you know what, we don't even know where they came from. They're just there in our subconscious, telling us how to respond to life circumstances. And these are the hard ones to change, unless something even stronger happens to challenge them. Well, that happens in Acts 15. And Acts 15 is a record of perhaps the single most important clash of thoughts about God in church history. It was hugely significant in the early church, and I believe it's just as relevant and just as significant for your life and my life today. So before I catch something in here, or before I get stuck in here forever, how about we go for a walk down the road and visit some of our neighbours? So around 34 AD, we had that story in Acts 9 of Saul, who we'll now call Paul, having his life radically changed. All of a sudden, he's met Jesus. His life has changed, and he goes from being one of the chief persecutors of the Christians to being one of the chief advocates of the gospel that he hated. And then for the next decade, really from the late 30s to the late 40s, so much takes place in the early church. In fact, Luke describes this in Acts chapters 10 to 14, but it's such a brief summary of all that goes on. We looked a couple of weeks ago at the way that Sophie talked about how Peter has an incredible experience with Cornelius and his household, and the way that he was seeing the gospel take place and grow in unexpected places. But then, as we saw last week with Ben, the gospel keeps growing, and the church is taking root in the most unlikely of places, like Turkey and Syria, and all the way toward Greece. I mean, so much was happening in this period. So much change, so much fruit, so much growth. Something wonderful was happening that had the mother church in Jerusalem both amazed and perplexed. Like, they kind of should have known this was going to happen. Jesus said to them that the gospel would go out from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and all the way to the ends of the world. And that's what was happening. It was amazing. It was everything that they'd hoped for. But it came with some implications. But unlike Cornelius, who and his household that adopted Jewish cultural practices, all of a sudden there were people that were coming to faith that weren't adopting those practices. They were still being touched by the Spirit of God. They were still being clearly impacted by God, but they weren't Jews. They weren't even nearly Jews. What do you do with them? We pick this up in Acts chapter 15. We read, certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said, the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. Who on earth were these people? Well, they were most likely Jews who had come to believe in Jesus as the Messiah after all. And I'm sure they were well-intentioned. They were wanting to see to it that these new believers understood what they thought God required for them to be right with him. And they thought that it was Jesus plus the law of Moses. Jesus was, after all, a Jew, so what else would they have expected? And to be fair to these people, the law of Moses was 1,000 years of entrenched thinking already. And they were also under severe attack from the Romans and the pagan world around them. So if pagan people are coming to faith, well, they jolly well better stop living like pagans too, which in particular meant undergoing some kind of awkward ancient cosmetic surgery for the blokes called circumcision. Kids, you can ask your parents to explain that one later. I can just imagine the scene. You've just made a new Jewish friend named Benjamin, and he calls you up and he says, hey, do you want to come over for dinner? And you say, sure, I'd love to. What time? 7:30. Great. Can I bring anything? No, don't need to. And then he says, and then he explains what it means to have table fellowship with him. And then you realise that you were out of town that day because you probably don't want to go after all. That was the implications of the Jews thinking that everybody needed to be like them. In summary, their essential message was, if you want to be right with God and part of the family, then you need Jesus plus Jewish customs and laws. And friends, this thought has reproduced itself over and over again in various forms since the beginning of time. The deep ache that we all have is that if there is a God, then are we okay? And how can I get right with that God? I mean, what will cause God to like me, to show his favour? Be that rain falling from the sky, or crops growing, or winning battles, or prosperity, or health, or anything that we might want. And you know, the primal belief is that we're born with this feeling that God's favour depends on your behaviour. The God's up there wagging his wrinkly old finger thinking you're pathetic, totally unsatisfied with you. But if you tick all the right boxes, you may swing him around to changing his mind about you. Maybe. And this is what, in the negative sense we call religion. And great thinkers across time, like Freud and Marx and Nietzsche, just in the last few hundred years, have rightly criticised this as manipulative, as elitist, and even a way to justify evil, because so long as you can appease God, then you can go on doing whatever you like with the rest of your time. It's like we're hardwired for religious thinking, and even Christians are. And after 2,000 years, we still find new things that we must add to Jesus in order that we might be acceptable to him and our fellow Christians. I spent a chunk of last week visiting about a dozen of our amazing seniors. And a question that I asked several was, where have you seen a lot of change in your life? And many of them referenced the change they've seen in their Christian life. Some of them said, growing up we were never allowed to go to the pictures, and you definitely couldn't drink, and dancing was a real no-no, and rock music, well, that was of the devil. But that's all changed, they said, and they would say for the better. But rest assured, every generation finds new things to subtly add to Jesus. Now, you may have very little to do with Jesus, but before I move on, I wonder if you can see that you're just as driven to feel like you're righteous in some way. You might say, well, I'm a really good person, I'm a good moral person, or I don't rip people off, or I don't cheat on my partner, or I volunteer in the RFS, or I give to the Salvation Army when they come around. And again, just like everyone else, you're putting confidence in something that you've done. You've written your own contract with God or the universe in the hope that it will provide sufficient leverage when you really need it. But look, here's the thing. The gospel is actually the opposite of all of this thinking. Unlike Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or animism or any isms, other worldviews that are based on formulas or good works in order to gain favour with their deity, Christianity is fundamentally different at this point. The gospel is actually the death of all of that thinking. That it's actually not about anything that you can do to appease or to please God. Nothing at all. Now, not surprisingly, read in verse 2, this brought Paul and Barnabas into sharp dispute and debate with them. So, Paul and Barnabas head to Jerusalem to sort out all the mess at what became known as the Council of Jerusalem. At this meeting, they explained the signs and the wonders and the salvations among the pagan world, and that from all the evidence, God didn't seem to have favourites anymore. All sorts of people were believing and being saved and filled with His Spirit, and therefore all that seemed to matter was believing and trusting in Jesus. The Apostle Peter sums these radical reports up with a radical conclusion in verse 11. He says, "No, we believe it is through the grace of our Lord Jesus that we are saved, just as they are." Did you get that? We are all saved the same way, by the grace of Jesus. So what is this grace of Jesus? The little Greek word for grace is the word charis, and it means both a type of gift but also a type of attitude that the giver gives in giving the gift. It's where we get our word charity from, and charity is what? Someone giving to another with a spirit of kindness and generosity and without any need of payment or of obligation. So the grace of Jesus is both the gift of Jesus Himself, His perfect life and His sacrifice for us, and it's the way Jesus gives Himself to us, that the core desire behind the giving. So how are people receiving this gift of Jesus? Peter and Paul both conclude it's through the undeserved kindness, generosity, and favour of God that the gift is given, without any sense of payment or any sense of obligation. I mean, it's a gift after all. And it's only really a gift if it's free, isn't it? I mean, if you give me a gift and I say, "Hey, thanks," and then I pull out my wallet and say, "Now, how much do I owe you?" You'd be offended because you were giving me a gift. Or conversely, if you gave me what you said was a gift and then you wrote out an invoice for me to pay it in full, then I'd be feeling, well, kind of ripped off or swindled. See, here is the radical shift in thinking. You can't pay for or earn God's love or forgiveness. You can only accept your acceptance. But let's be honest, that's a bit hard to believe. I mean, we don't believe anything is free. We can't believe that God could accept us without condition or without our improvements. Everything's conditional, isn't it? We live in an IOU culture. I owe you one. But here is the scandalous message of the gospel, that all your good deeds are as filthy rags, and you getting right with God is His work, not yours. See, it's the reverse. It's Jesus' perfect performance, not your best attempts. It's like He's the billionaire and you're paying Him off with pennies. And not only is it not enough, but it's the wrong currency to begin with. Friend, God already likes you. And not because you cleaned up your life or you ticked all the right boxes. There's no earning, there's no favourites, there's no pass mark. What Peter is saying here is it's faith in Jesus plus nothing. Maybe today this is one of those moments when this new thought has to confront some entrenched thinking that you have about God. Because if it's true, two things actually happen. Firstly, you'll begin to become immune to religious guilt and manipulation. You can't be manipulated so easily. And secondly, you can begin to allow yourself to feel the lightness of God actually liking you. Because friends, He does. And what the Jewish Christians had missed in 1,000 years of entrenched thinking was that being in God's family, well, it's always been by His grace alone. After all the debate, James, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, concludes by saying in verse 19, "It's my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. Instead, we should write to them, telling them to abstain from food polluted by idols, from sexual immorality, and from the meat of strangled animals, and from blood." That's it. Aha, you say. See, I told you there was a catch after all. Well, we'll discuss this more in our small groups, but what James concludes here is not a contradiction to what he just said, but an affirmation that they're already saved and an encouragement to move in the same love that they've received. See, grace moves us to love as we have been loved. Each of these recommendations are actually responses to what were the hallmarks of pagan religious and social practice of the time. That to continue in those things would do three things. Firstly, it would just simply confuse or pollute their personal relationship with Jesus, because they would still be entrenched in that same pagan worldview. Secondly, it would undermine their ability to have fellowship and to be in unity with the Jewish believers. And thirdly, it would derail their witness, both in the pagan world, but also to the Jewish world. In the letter that would be eventually delivered back to the churches, they simply say, you will do well to avoid these things. And today, we who are believers apply that same principle of grace. We have been freely loved at no charge. So how do we now move in love for the sake of the integrity of our personal discipleship, for the sake of our unity as the church, and for the sake of our witness in the world? Listen, if you're a follower of Jesus, by all means do good, do brilliantly, but remember, anything that you do is not for God's love, but it's from God's love. Lastly, if you're still trying to work out what to believe at all, start with letting this new thought get louder in your life, that Jesus, He already likes you, that you don't earn it and you can't repay it. You can just believe it and let grace grow in you. This is why we call it the good news. I want to encourage you to connect with a church in your local area, or if you live in our area, then come and connect with us at Georges River Life Church. In fact, you can email me at care@grlc.org.au. I hope that you realise that this little word called grace has changed the world. It's the death of religion. It reveals the heart of God, and it can change your life too. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you for your grace. Thank you that you so profoundly demonstrated it in your life and your death and your resurrection. Thank you that it comes as a gift, that we can't repay it, we can only receive it. And I pray that each person listening to this today might receive this gift, and that this truth would just set their lives on a brand new course. Thank you that this is your heart for every single person listening. I pray that they might receive this gift today wholeheartedly and let grace transform their lives from this day on. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks for joining me today. Would love for you to connect with us through our small groups, and there's great content there that you can go through with your small group. Anyway, have a great day. God bless. Thanks. Goodbye.